A clay tablet sits in a museum right now, and it describes the Great Flood before a single drop of water appears. Not rain, not rivers. A disturbance in the heavens. A council of gods convening somewhere above the world the Sumerians could see. Scholars have read this text for a century. Most call it poetry, read it literally instead, and something breaks. The oldest flood story on Earth does not begin on Earth. It begins elsewhere. Water comes after. If that reading holds, everything you think you know about this story is wrong. Subscribe. Where did it actually begin? In the late 19th century, archaeologists working at Nippur in what is now southern Iraq uncovered thousands of clay tablets buried beneath the ruins of one of Sumer's oldest cities. The excavation was led by the University of Pennsylvania, one of the first American expeditions to work systematically in Mesopotamia. The haul was staggering. Tens of thousands of fragments, pulled from mounds that had sat undisturbed for millennia. Nippur was not a capital in the ordinary political sense. It was something far more important than that. It was the religious centre of the Sumerian world, the seat of the god Enlil, the place where the gods themselves were believed to convene. Among the fragments was a text that would eventually become known as the Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest written accounts of a great flood ever recovered from the ancient world. The tablet is damaged. Large sections are missing, broken away by thousands of years underground and centuries more of disturbance before excavation. Even seasoned translators disagree on certain lines, arguing over gaps that may never be filled. But enough survives to establish something remarkable. Long before Noah, long before the Hebrew scriptures existed in any form, the Sumerians had already committed to clay a story of divine anger, a chosen survivor, a boat and a flood that erased almost everything. This is not a myth borrowed from later cultures. It is very likely the source those later myths eventually drew from, reshaped across 1,000 years of Mesopotamian history before finding its way into the biblical account, transmitted through Babylonian and Assyrian intermediaries whose own versions survive in far better condition. Alongside the flood fragments sits something equally strange, uncovered in the same excavation from the same period of digging. The Sumerian king list. On its surface it reads like an administrative record, a chronology of rulers and the length of their reigns stretching back into the deep past. Then the pattern breaks. The reigns recorded before a certain point stretch into tens of thousands of years, numbers so large they cannot be reconciled with any known chronology. Then, without ceremony, the text states plainly that the flood swept over the land, and kingship descended from heaven a second time. After that line, the reign lengths collapse into something resembling ordinary human timeframes. Scholars have debated this division for over a century, and no full consensus has ever been reached on what those impossible reign lengths were actually meant to represent. The king list does not simply mention a flood in passing. It uses the flood as a hinge point, a hard boundary separating one kind of world from another entirely. Before the flood, impossibly long reigns, kings whose lifespans defy explanation. After the flood, kingship re-established, but changed, diminished, brought down to something closer to what we would recognize as human. This is not a text treating the flood as a single unfortunate storm among many others. This is a rupture in the order of the world itself. The earliest translators noticed something else, something that has never fully settled into consensus even a century later. Arno Pobel, working through fragments of the king list in the early 20th century, and later Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the most respected Assyriologists of the modern era, both encountered phrasing in the flood material that did not behave the way a simple weather event should. The language surrounding the flood's origin does not describe storm clouds gathering or rivers rising in the distance. It describes something happening first among the gods, in a location the texts consistently place above, in the heavens, before any water is mentioned at all. And here is where the story most people already think they know breaks away from the story the tablets actually preserve. In the fragments from Nippur, the flood does not begin as a natural disaster the gods merely react to after the fact. It begins with an assembly, a council, a gathering of divine figures who convene, deliberate, and arrive at a decision before the waters ever appear in the text. The tablets are too damaged to preserve the full content of that deliberation. But the sequence that survives is unambiguous. Council first, decision second, water only third. What that council decided, and what exactly convened it, is not something the Eridu Genesis answers on its own. The tablet breaks off exactly where the details would matter most, leaving generations of translators to reconstruct the missing pieces from later, more complete texts written centuries afterward in Akkadian. But the sequence preserved at Nippur, fragmentary as it is, establishes something later. More polished versions of the story tend to obscure entirely. In the oldest surviving account of the flood that human beings ever wrote down, the event does not start with weather. It starts somewhere else, in a place the text calls the heavens. Among figures the Sumerians did not consider human, deciding something that only afterward became a flood. Whatever comes next in this investigation, that order of events is where it has to begin. To understand what the heavens meant to the people who first wrote these tablets down in cuneiform, take a moment and set aside the modern picture of sky as empty space and stars as distant suns. That is simply not what this is. The Sumerians organised their entire universe into 3 layers, and each layer had a name, and was the sky, the heavens, the domain of the highest divine authority in the entire pantheon, the source from which legitimate rule was said to descend down to human kings. Ki was the earth, the solid ground beneath human feet, the ordinary realm of mortals, cities, rivers, and growing things, the world people actually lived in day to day. Between and beneath them sat the Abzu, the primeval freshwater deep, the domain of the god Enki. Not simply underground water, a source, a place where knowledge, creation, and formative power originated before anything on the surface existed. Enki is described as working there, shaping things below in careful secret before they ever surface into the world humans can actually see. Some translations render it as a physical body of fresh water beneath the Earth's crust. Others treat it as something closer to a principle, an abstract wellspring from which order itself emerges. This 3-part structure was not decoration. It was the operating logic of Sumerian cosmology, and it shows up constantly in their literature, from hymns to royal inscriptions to the administrative texts that govern daily temple life. Gods move between these realms with clear purpose, according to the texts. Decisions made in An have consequences in Ki. The Abzu is where Enki works, schemes, and occasionally intervenes to protect humanity from decisions made above him. When the tablets describe a council convening before the flood, they are not describing a vague, undefined gathering. They are describing an assembly inside a specific cosmological architecture, one the Sumerians understood in careful structured detail, even if the surviving fragments do not preserve exactly where within it the council actually sat. Here is where a hard line needs to be drawn between 3 different things: what the tablets explicitly state, what most Assyriologists agree the texts most plausibly mean, and what remains genuinely speculative. This distinction matters enough to say plainly once, before going further. The tablets explicitly state that a divine assembly convened before the flood, that this assembly took place in a location associated with the heavens rather than the earth, and that a decision was reached there before any water is mentioned. Mainstream consensus reads this as standard narrative structure, the gods conferring in council the way any royal court might, using divine geography as a literary framework rather than a literal physical location. That reading is well supported, grounded in decades of careful comparative textual work, and it should not be dismissed simply because it is less dramatic than the alternative. What remains speculative is smaller, sharper, and worth stating carefully. A minority of researchers, most working outside traditional Assyriology, have asked this for decades, and it is worth saying clearly that this remains a minority position, rather than an emerging consensus. If the language of divine assembly was, in some cases, describing something the ancient authors understood as more than metaphor, what would that mean for how you read the flood's origin? This is not a claim the tablets make explicitly anywhere in the surviving text. It should not be treated as one, no matter how compelling the phrasing sounds in isolation. It is a question raised by the persistence and specificity of certain phrases that do not behave the way purely symbolic language usually behaves elsewhere in Sumerian literature. Consider the difference. When Sumerian texts want to describe something symbolically, they use recognizable poetic devices. Repetition, parallel structure, stock epithets attached to familiar gods, the kind of formulaic language that repeats across dozens of unrelated compositions. The flood material at Nippur does something else. It places procedural weight on sequence and location, as though the author were recording an account rather than composing a hymn. This proves nothing at all on its own, and it would be a mistake to treat stylistic difference as evidence of literal truth. It is an observation about style, one that has pushed some translators, cautiously and without full agreement among themselves, to ask harder questions about what the earliest Sumerian scribes believed they were writing down. None of this answers what the council decided, or why the flood followed from it. The later, more complete Akkadian versions fill in what the Sumerian fragments leave out, and here is something worth being clear about before going further. The stated motive in the Atrahasis epic is explicit. It is not cosmic in nature at all. It is human noise, an ordinary and almost mundane grievance disturbing the sleep of the god Enlil. That detail matters a great deal, and it will need to be weighed against the heavens disturbed imagery from Nippur, because the two do not obviously agree with each other. That tension is exactly where this investigation goes next. Sit with this tension before moving past it, because it is the closest thing this investigation has to a genuine, unresolved contradiction sitting directly in the source material itself. On one hand, the Atrahasis epic states the cause of the flood in blunt, almost domestic, entirely unremarkable terms. Humanity multiplied, humanity made noise. The noise itself disturbed Enlil's rest, and Enlil, increasingly irritated by the clamour rising from the cities below, brought the matter before the full assembly of the gods, demanding something more permanent than the plagues and famines he had already tried and failed with. On the other hand, the older Sumerian fragments recovered at Nippur frame the moments leading up to the flood using the vocabulary of the heavens. A disturbance located above, not a simple nuisance located below on the earth. These are not necessarily two contradictory reasons for the exact same catastrophe. They may instead be two layers of the same underlying story, an earthly grievance and a cosmological staging ground, folded together over time by generations of scribes copying and recopying a tradition that had already begun to drift by the time it reached its most complete surviving form in Akkadian. This kind of layering is not unique to Mesopotamia. Flood traditions recur across an unusually wide range of unrelated cultures, and comparative mythologists have long noted the pattern without ever fully agreeing on what produces it. The Hebrew flood account describes windows of heaven opening alongside the breaking up of the fountains of the great deep, language that curiously echoes the Sumerian An and Abzu structure examined earlier. Two sources of water, one above and one below, converging at once. Flood narratives from cultures with no plausible direct contact with Mesopotamia whatsoever, from the Americas to the Pacific Islands to ancient China, also describe a great destruction by water, sometimes preceded by disturbance in the sky. Strange lights, falling objects, a darkening of the heavens before the water arrives. Mainstream comparative mythology explains this recurring pattern through the shared human experience of catastrophic regional flooding, common and severe enough across early river-based agricultural societies to produce structurally similar stories independently, without requiring any direct contact between the cultures that tell them. That explanation accounts for a great deal, and it should remain the default, most responsible reading of the available evidence at this point in the investigation. It does not, on its own, fully explain why so many otherwise unrelated traditions specifically place the flood's origin above, in the sky, rather than simply in rising rivers or the sea, which would be the more obvious explanation for a society built along a floodplain. Set that specific question aside for now, because the Sumerian and Akkadian material has its own scene to finish, and it is the fullest, most detailed version of the divine council that survives anywhere from the ancient world. In the Atrahasis epic, the assembly convenes formally, the gods gathering in a manner the text treats with the same procedural weight given to a royal court settling a serious dispute. Enlil speaks first in that hall, laying out his grievance at considerable length before the entire assembled court of gods. The younger gods present in that hall, still resentful over generations of forced labour before humanity existed to relieve them of it, do not object strongly to his proposal. Ninhursag, the mother goddess who helped shape humanity out of raw clay in the first place, is conspicuously silent in what survives. Her position lost to damage in the tablet, a gap that has frustrated translators for decades. The vote, such as it is described in what remains of the damaged text, moves steadily and almost unanimously toward destruction. A flood, total and final, meant to erase every last trace of the noise that started it all. One god present in that hall does not agree, or if he agrees publicly, he does not comply privately. Enki, lord of the Abzu and the god most closely associated with humanity's original creation, bound by an oath not to warn any human being directly, finds a way around the letter of that oath without technically breaking it. He does not speak to a man, he speaks, according to the text, to a reed wall, knowing full well that a man named Atrahasis, or in the earlier and more fragmentary Sumerian version Ziusudra, sleeps on the other side of it and will overhear everything. Through the wall, Enki tells him plainly to tear down his house and build a boat, to abandon his possessions and save life instead of things, to seal the vessel completely shut and wait for what is coming. The instructions that follow are strikingly specific. Exact dimensions, particular materials, careful provisions listed almost like an inventory, the kind of procedural detail that stands in sharp contrast to the more poetic, formulaic language used elsewhere in the same text. That contrast is worth remembering carefully when the story reaches its next stage, because it will matter again before this investigation is finished. The flood arrives, and here the three surviving traditions, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, and Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, finally converge into something close to a single coherent account, despite having been composed and copied across centuries in two different languages. The storm lasts 7 days and 7 nights, an interval that recurs so consistently across the versions it functions almost as a fixed formula rather than a remembered detail. The boat rides out the destruction while everything outside it is erased. Cities, fields, every living creature not sealed inside the vessel with the survivor. When the waters recede, the survivor releases birds to search for dry land. First a dove, then a swallow, then a raven that does not return, a sign that solid ground has finally appeared somewhere beyond the endless water. The survivor makes an offering, and the gods, described in Gilgamesh as starving and desperate after days without a single human sacrifice to sustain them, gather around the smell of it like flies drawn to something they cannot resist. It is one of the most vivid, almost unmouthable images in the entire body of Mesopotamian literature. Gods reduced to hunger, entirely dependent on the very humans they had just tried, deliberately and unanimously, to destroy. Enlil arrives late to this scene, furious to discover that someone survived his carefully unanimous decision. Enki, present among the gathered gods and no longer bound by any need for secrecy, does not deny his role in the outcome. He defends it openly, arguing before the assembled gods that destroying all of humanity indiscriminately was never a proportionate response to something as trivial as noise, and that other, more targeted solutions had always existed. The argument works, or at least Enlil relents, apparently persuaded, or perhaps simply exhausted by the scale of what has already been done. The survivor and his wife are granted a kind of divine status, set apart permanently from ordinary humanity, and the story closes with an uneasy, unresolved peace between gods who nearly erased their own creation entirely and the single family that happened to escape the decision. Now return, carefully and without exaggeration, to the theories researchers outside mainstream Assyriology have proposed to explain the more anomalous language scattered through the older layers of this tradition. The disturbance in the heavens, the sequence that places a cosmic event before the water itself ever appears. These theories fall into a few identifiable categories, and it is worth naming them honestly rather than treating them as one single uniform idea. Some researchers point to comet or bolide impact hypotheses, the possibility that a fragmenting comet or a series of airbursts around the end of the Younger Dryas period could have triggered rapid climate disruption and catastrophic flooding across multiple regions of the world at once, a theory that has gained real traction in geological circles independent of any Mesopotamian source material. Others point to abrupt climate shifts documented in ice core and sediment data from roughly the same broad prehistoric era. Sudden temperature swings, sea level changes, reshaped coastlines within a human lifetime. A smaller group goes further still, arguing that the disturbance in the heavens language preserved at Nippur should be read as a memory, however distorted by thousands of years of oral and scribal transmission of an actual observed celestial event. Something seemed clearly in the sky that a Bronze Age culture had no framework to describe except through the vocabulary of its gods. Here is the boldest, sharpest version of that argument. If the oldest surviving flood account places the origin of the catastrophe above the Earth rather than on it, and if independent geological and astronomical evidence points to a genuine climate-altering event occurring in roughly the same window of deep prehistory, then the Sumerians may have preserved something closer to observation than to invention. A garbled but real record of a moment when the sky itself seemed to break before the water ever rose. That claim deserves an immediate and serious counter-argument, because it is far from settled among specialists and should not be presented as though it were. The chronological alignment between Younger Dryas era disruption and the Sumerian flood tradition is genuinely contested, resting on dating methods with real margins of error on both sides of the comparison. Mainstream Assyriologists point out that heavens and sky are among the most common metaphorical locations for divine action across nearly every category of Mesopotamian text, used constantly and casually in contexts that have nothing to do with catastrophe. That meaningfully weakens the case for treating this instance as strictly literal. The regional flooding explanation, grounded firmly in the documented behaviour of the Tigris and Euphrates system, remains simpler, needs no exotic astronomical event, and accounts for the water without explaining where it originated in the sky. What remains, after weighing both sides of this argument honestly and evenly, is not a resolved answer. It is a genuinely open question, and that openness is itself worth sitting with rather than resolving prematurely in either direction. Step back now, away from the individual tablets and the individual arguments, and look at what the oldest civilization on Earth actually chose to preserve out of everything it could have written down and simply did not. The Sumerian king list itself does not simply note that a flood occurred somewhere in the deep past, the way a modern chronicle might record a bad harvest or a broken dam and move on. It uses the flood as the single hinge on which the entire structure of remembered history turns, the one moment the scribes treated as more consequential than any war, any dynasty, any individual reign. Before it, kings whose reigns are measured in tens of thousands of years, a world the text itself seems to acknowledge as almost unrecognisable, closer to legend than to administration, a chronology no honest reader can take fully at face value. After it, kingship descending from heaven again, but reduced, human-scaled, brought down abruptly into something closer to the world the scribes themselves actually lived in and could recognise. Whatever the flood was, to the people who wrote this down carefully on clay, it was not simply a disaster among many others in the historical record. It was the boundary between one kind of existence and another entirely, a rupture severe enough to justify restarting the very concept of legitimate rule from scratch. Bring the threads back together now, one final time, and be honest about what each one actually supports and what it does not. The archaeology at Nippur itself is not in question, and never really has been. The tablets exist, physically, in museum collections scholars continue to study today, and they have been translated and retranslated by generations of careful researchers working across more than a century of sustained effort. The sequence they preserve, counsel before water, decision before catastrophe, is there in the text regardless of how it is ultimately interpreted. The cosmology is not speculative either. An, Ki, and the Abzu formed a real structured framework that governed how the Sumerians understood divine action across their entire literature, and placing the flood's origin within that framework is a defensible, well-grounded reading rooted directly in the culture's own vocabulary. The comparative mythology is suggestive without being conclusive on its own, a pattern repeated across unrelated cultures with no plausible contact between them, one that may reflect shared catastrophe, shared human psychology, or something else entirely that comparative method alone simply cannot settle with the evidence currently available. And the geological and astronomical theories discussed earlier remain exactly that, theories. Worth taking seriously, actively debated among specialists in their own right, but not yet confirmed in any way that would let anyone answer this question with genuine certainty in either direction. What can be said honestly, without overselling the case in either direction, and without pretending to a certainty the evidence does not support, is this. The Sumerians did not write the flood as a simple weather event, an ordinary storm remembered and exaggerated over generations of retelling. They wrote it as the outcome of a decision made somewhere they consistently called the heavens, arrived at by beings they did not consider human, before a single description of rain or rising rivers ever enters the account at any point in the surviving text. That sequence survives in the oldest layer of the tradition we have access to, older than Babylon, older than the version that eventually reached the authors of Genesis, older than nearly anything else written down by human hands anywhere in the ancient world, whether that sequence encodes a literal, factual memory of something actually observed in the sky, or whether it simply reflects how a culture without our vocabulary chose to narrate its gods and its disasters, is a question the tablets themselves, damaged and incomplete as they are, do not answer for us. What they leave behind instead is an open invitation, phrased in clay, buried for thousands of years, and only partially recovered even now, with entire sections still missing and likely lost forever. The oldest known civilization on this earth remembered something about water, about survival, about a decision made somewhere above the world they could see with their own eyes. Perhaps that is all it ever truly was, nothing more, nothing hidden underneath. A story about rain, dressed in the poetic language available to the people who told it first, using the only vocabulary they had for something they did not fully understand themselves. Or perhaps the memory runs deeper than the poetry, and the Sumerians preserved not simply a flood, but the recollection of a moment when the sky itself seemed to move first, and everything else, the water, the boat, the survival, followed only after. The tablets do not resolve which of these is true, and they were never going to. They only ask, patiently and without ever demanding an answer, across 6,000 years of silence, whether you are willing to sit honestly with the possibility that the flood the world remembers did not begin here at all.